Shavua Tov, one of the most puzzling and troubling commandments is in this week's parsha, the commandment of the rebellious son, the Ben Soror Moreh, who does not obey his parents, who is a glutton and an alcoholic, and so the parents bring him to the court, which condemns him to death by stoning. Woe, is that troubling, woe, is that puzzling, and woe, is that relevant and important even in this day and age. Not literally, we don't kill sons. But one needs to understand something fundamental about this commandment because it is crucial for every parent to understand this fact, as we will explain. But this is a very puzzling commandment. Is this simply a parenting tool on steroids, like the Gary Larson cartoon from the Far Side about the father who says to his son, "You better behave or we're going to have one of our appointments"? And the caption reads, "The parental advantages of being a dentist." Is it that? Well, one thing that we do notice is that without the rabbis, we are lost on this one. And the rabbis and the oral law, they are the ones that will save us. And without them, horrible and cruel things could happen, as do happen in the world. After all, some of the cultures around us practice honor killings of daughters who disobey the family dictates. So stranger and horribler things have indeed happened. Indeed, we fast on the 10th of Tevet because of the translation of the Torah to Greek. Even though that translation took place under miraculous circumstances with the 70 Chachamim, nonetheless, we fast because the Torah shebichtav, the written Torah without the oral law, can be misinterpreted to justify a lot of cruel things. An eye for an eye becomes much more lethal without the Torah Shebaal Peh to tell us that it's dealing with money, all the more so this troubling commandment. So it's an advertisement for the oral law to begin with. But there is something societally very relevant in this commandment which I wish to focus on. But let's take a look at what the oral law says. The oral law basically explains this commandment out of existence. It puts so many limitations on it so that it's impossible that it should really ever happen. The child has to be 13 years old, and for a period of only 3 months could they be brought to the court. 3 months after the bar mitzvah, when they're still considered a bain. After 3 months, they are a potential father, because if they got married on the day of the bar mitzvah and got the wife pregnant on that day, she would show after 3 months, and then he's already transitioning to a father. So it's only a very small window of time. And he has to eat a certain quantity of meat and drink a certain quantity of wine. That meat and that wine cannot be consumed in Yerushalayim, because in Yerushalayim they bring sacrifices, and therefore you can't blame him for eating meat and having wine when he sees it all around him done by pious people in the service of God. So it has to be out of Yerushalayim. The wine can't be from the land of Israel. It has to be Italian wine, because the wine from the land of Israel has sanctity to it. It's very interesting to note that Orthodox Jews consume more wine than the general population, and yet have less instances of alcoholism. Why so? Because the Orthodox Jew drinks wine for Kiddush Friday night, Kiddush Shabbos morning. You may have a l'chaim then too, and then Havdalah Saturday night. So it's all done in the service of God in holiness, and that protects them from alcoholism, which is drinking for psychological and emotional reasons, and which is the result of the body developing a dependence on alcohol in order to maintain some kind of perceived stability. So therefore, it's a different context. So this child has to first of all show signs of gluttony and alcoholism without any holiness attached to it. And it's also a 3-month period. The parents have to have the same voice. I don't know if that means that the mother needs to take hormones to have a baritone as well, or perhaps more likely, like Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch says, they have to speak with a united voice. They have to not have injuries, but they have to physically be able to bring him by hand. They have to have good vision, and so forth and so on. There are a lot of limitations, so many so that the rabbis comment that the Ben Soror Moreh, the rebellious son, never was and never will be. If that's the case, ask the rabbis, that this commandment is completely impossible, then why is it written in the Torah in the first place? So they give an answer, a beautiful, famous answer. Derosh v'kabel sachar. Interpret it, and you will be rewarded. What exactly is the reward? What does this mean, that God can make up a commandment that's not relevant, that's completely out in left field, and give us the opportunity to learn things and be rewarded for learning it? just studying something that's impossible? No, it must mean that the reward comes from what you're going to learn by studying this commandment. And one could say that if it's referring to the child learns this commandment, they are going to get rewarded. Why? Because they'll think about that Gary Larson cartoon. They'll realize the parenting advantages of having the ability to say to the kid, hey, you better knock it off or we're going to the court. The child learns that and he gets reward. He won't become a bein sorer moreh. And one can say the same for the parents too. That if they learn how to be good parents, so then they will never bring their kid to the court because their kid is going to be a little angel. And so therefore they will get reward as well. That certainly is a very valid and important explanation. But the rabbis, they see another story taking place here. And I'll introduce this section by mentioning that this is going to be based on the explanation of the great Rabbi Dr. Abraham Twersky, who was the scion of a Hasidic dynasty and also a very well-known, internationally renowned expert on addictions and recovery, who had a clinic in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which was very famous for helping people recover from addictions. And he introduces this section by saying somebody who does not understand addictions will never properly understand this commandment. With that as a background, let's take a look at what the rabbis say. Why is this child, 13 years old in a few weeks, put to death for having had too much meat and too much wine in a disobedient manner to his parents? Now, you could answer, you could say, perhaps, a little tongue-in-cheek, that the Torah tells us the reward for honoring one's father and one's mother is a long life. And, well, if he doesn't honor his mother and his father and his mother, he won't get a long life. Why? Because they'll take him to the court. That could be a little tongue-in-cheek answer, but I think that there's something deeper. The rabbis tell us that there is a story that is yet to unfold. Nidon al shem sofo. He's judged because of who he's going to become. And who is he going to become? The rabbis say a murderer. Why? Because he's got an addiction to the meat and to the wine, probably more to the wine than even to the meat, but he's an addicted person. And an addicted person will never get over their addiction, and they will never be a productive member of a society. And in order to feed their addiction, they're going to need money, and he's going to go and he's going to attempt to rob people, and he might indeed end up murdering someone in order to feed his addiction. So one could ask, wow, at the end of the day, what we're doing here is we're taking somebody who hasn't committed a sin other than being disrespectful to their parents, and we're killing them, whereas a murderer is only put to death for the murder if there were witnesses that warned him. So here the kid hasn't even done anything, and yet we're putting him to death. And when we put him to death, based on what he's going to do, which is what the rabbis say, based on what he's going to do, then why don't we put him to death with the death penalty of a murderer? A murderer is put to death by what's called cherev, or the sword. That is the death penalty for murder, not stoning. Stoning is the death penalty for other sins. But if we're going to put this kid to death because he's certainly going to be a murderer, let's take that as a certainty, that he's certainly going to become a murderer, then we should put him to death by the sword, like other murderers. But no, we don't. Why is that? The commentaries attempt to find answers. I'm going to suggest one in a little bit. But the whole thing is very, very puzzling. Why are we doing this? Well, when you think about it, addictions, and today it's not just alcohol, obviously, it's hard drugs. Addictions and murder sadly go together. Look at some of the inner cities in the United States and elsewhere where there are high murder rates. There are also high drug addiction rates, and many of those murders, maybe even most of them, I don't know statistics, are related to drugs and drug dealing. That's what the rabbis are saying. This child is going to grow up to be a drug user or maybe even a drug dealer, and is going to commit murder in the course of that career, as it were. Now, which parent would like to see their child grow up to become a murderer? No one that I know. Unfortunately, there are other people in this part of the world who don't have that problem, sadly. But normal parents are nowhere near there. And so the Torah is basically saying the following cautionary tale. Says Rabbi Twersky, addiction must be met with tough love, because an addict will never recover, says Rabbi Twersky, never, unless the price of their addiction, the pain caused by their addiction, becomes stronger than the pleasure or emotional relief that their addiction brings them. A person is addicted to wine, to drugs, to whatever they're addicted to, not because they just like it, but because somehow their life has become unmanageable, and this addiction helps them slide through it. And as long as they have emotional turmoil, they will never get past this addiction until the addiction itself creates even more emotional turmoil. In other words, the addict must have a crisis before they will actually make the change. And so the Torah is telling us something very powerful, that a parent that loves their child will not sit by idly while this addiction grows, especially at the most formative age of 13 years and the next few months, when the child has just become bar mitzvah and is now defining who they are going to be going forward, what kind of moral and spiritual life they will lead. At that time it's decided, and an addiction then is lethal and dangerous, and the parents must have tough love. They must, as Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch says, they must speak with a unified voice. They must have their hands, meaning they must physically be able to discipline this child and prevent him from going down that bad path. They must be able to see everything that's going on and understand it, and they must be prepared to take the child to the court. Now, nowadays we don't do this, and it's completely forbidden to obviously to harm physically one's child. But if the child has an addiction, the parents must not enable it. They must not pay for it. They might even consider referring the child to the court, to the police, if the child steals from them to feed their addiction. They might even consider kicking the child out of their house. Sometimes there is a need for tough love. And when the price of the addiction becomes greater than the relief that it brings, that's when the child can change. And that's the lesson of this unique, troubling, but very important commandment. And I would add that when I think about it, it connects me to a parent who actually was willing to sacrifice their son, Avraham Avinu, and the binding of Isaac. Now that also, lo hayav lo atid liot, it didn't happen, meaning that that Abraham did not sacrifice Isaac. Spiritually, it's as if Isaac was sacrificed, but they both came down from the mountain at the end, and not a hair on Isaac's head had been harmed. Nonetheless, Abraham was willing to do it. Why? Because Abraham recognized that this is God's will. And God is telling him, your job is to create a world that believes in me, to spread the faith in God. And Abraham understood from God's commandment about Isaac that this is what he had to do. He had to perform this act of faith, and that would convince the world. And in that manner, Isaac would be his descendant spiritually. Now, God didn't actually mean for him to do this completely because he needed Isaac physically to be alive, but Abraham was willing and ready to do it spiritually, and he got credit as if he did. One could say that a parent who shows tough love to a child who's gone down a bad path is as if, and causes the child to change back, is as if they fulfilled this commandment of Bein Sorer Moreh. Very important, and I think that answers the question as to why he's not killed by the sword, which is the penalty which is given to a murderer, but rather by stoning, because stoning is not done by an individual, it's done by the whole community. If this child is allowed to continue in his addiction, he's a danger to the entire community. It affects all of them. And so therefore the community must also step up and prevent this from being in their midst. And one could say that here's an obligation on the community to make sure that addiction is not something that plagues their society. When we learn these things, we will have a great reward. What is the reward? Our communities will be safe, our children will be beautiful and wonderful, and if they get off the path, we'll know how to deal with it and bring them back to being beautiful and wonderful, and that's how things should be. Shavua Tov and B'sorot Tovot.